Hello guys, welcome to the Nexoel Trading Hub YouTube channel. So we're going to kick off with the Forex focus for the coming week. If you've been part of this community, then I believe that you've actually been a beneficiary of our weekly Forex focus. And also you have seen how those trade setups have been playing out and how we also carry out weekly reviews on those setups. So last week in the dollar index, you're anticipated to see the price fill up this price imbalance here, this fair value gap, and then we see the bearish movement of price to the downside. And you can see that actually played out beautifully. We can see the delivery of price to the downside for last week. So for the coming week, what we're seeing right now is that price created this weekly inverse fair value gap. So we anticipated normally to see that price should actually rate this buy side liquidity. But we can see that price failed to rate the buy side liquidity, and rather price give us this bearish momentum to the downside, where price is now being attracted to the sell side liquidity to actually fill up this weekly unmitigated fair value gap. So what we are actually seeing is that price actually mitigated this weekly fair value gap and then closed above the fair value gap and the consequent encroachment of the fair value gap, took out the sell side liquidity, and then price was rebooked by this price inefficiency here. So we can see that price mitigated the inefficiency. And if you can remember last week, we saw the confluence of this weekly fair value gap with this volume weekly breaker, and price mitigated that. And now we have a down close week for last week. Now price closed below this fair value gap with a momentum candle. So we're anticipating to see that price gives us a bullish ride to the upside to mitigate the inverse fair value gap before we see the continuation of price to give us a down close week. So we want to see Monday possibly give us a bullish push of price to the upside to mitigate the weekly inverse fair value gap. And then for that same week, we want to see a down close price and not an up close price. So because we're looking at the weekly unmitigated fair value gap resting here to actually attract price, where price rate this weekly sell side liquidity. So let's drop to the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, what you're going to see is that price is reacting at this daily fair value gap. And you can see we have this mitigation block because this is the last up close candle before we have this down close candle that give us the other block, and then we have this momentum of price to the upside that further push to rate this buy side liquidity. So we can see here, this is the weekly inverse fair value gap, price reacting at the daily fair value gap. So we want to see price push to the upside to be reclaimed by this down close candle that sponsored this bullish move that raided this buy side liquidity and mitigated the fair value gap, the weekly breaker volume block here that was left here. So we can also see that we saw this other block when price actually returned, mitigated this other block and gave us the push of price. Now you can see in confluence to the weekly inverse fair value gap, we have this other block and also this sponsorship candle that gave us the movement to the upside that raided this buy side liquidity and mitigated the fair value gap. So we want to see this weekly inversion fair value gap reclaim price, and then we now frame for the push of price to the downside to come raid the sell side liquidity and mitigate the weekly unmitigated fair value gap before we can consider any form of a bullish move to the upside. So we're anticipating to see price gets rejected to this level, and then we see price falls into the unmitigated weekly fair value gap. So this is the price movement we're anticipating in the dollar index. Let's check the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, we're going to see in the 4-hour time frame is that you can see that price is actually reacting at that daily fair value gap, which in the 4-hour time frame you can also see we have a fair value gap in the 4-hour time frame here. Now, within the weekly inverse fair value gap, we have this fair value gap in the 4-hour time frame that was mitigated and filled up, and now regard as an inverse fair value gap in the 4-hour time frame. So in the 4-hour time frame, we have this inverse fair value gap, price reacting at the daily fair value gap, and now in the 4-hour, we're having this fair value gap. So you can see in confidence to the weekly inverse fair value gap, we have the 4-hour fair value gap and also the 4-hour inverse fair value gap. So we're anticipating to see price get rebooked by this fair value gap before we see the push of price to the downside to raid the sell side liquidity and mitigate the weekly fair value gap. So this is what we're anticipating to see in the dollar index, to see the rise of price to the upside, and then we see price push to the downside to fill up this weekly unmitigated fair value gap. So this is actually the forecast for the dollar index for the coming week. So let's check out the EURUSD. This is the EURUSD weekly time frame, guys. So last week we anticipated to see price pull to the downside into this weekly inversion fair value gap, and then we see price gives us an up close week, and you can see that neatly happened. Price returned to the weekly inversion fair value gap, mitigated the consequent encroachment, and then we had the bullish move of price to the upside. Now what you're going to see from the weekly time frame is we are actually having a fair value gap here. We are actually having this fair value gap here from this candle week high to this candle week low points. So you can see we're actually having this fair value gap, but then price didn't really return to fill up the fair value gap. The reason behind this is actually because of the weekly inversion fair value gap we're seeing here. So price actually mitigated the consequent encroachment of the weekly inversion fair value gap, and then we can see the bullish move of price last week to the upside. So for the coming week, what we're anticipating to see is to see that price further push to the upside to raid this buy side liquidity, because we have this weekly fair value gap resting here, and we can see we have the order block here. So, but before that happens, we're anticipating to see down movements, and then we see price gives us an up close week. So we could see price return to this price level. That is actually the 1.08170 price level in the euro dollar. And then we now see price gives us the bullish move to the upside. So let's check out the daily time frame so that we can have more better perspective to price delivery. So what you're going to see here is this is actually the price level we mapped out from the weekly time frame, which is the 50% of the weekly candle week. So we're anticipating to see the push of price either to this price level, and then we see the bullish move to the upside. You can see price give us this momentum candle. Price mitigated this weekly inversion fair value gap, and we have this order block created here. So you can see we have this order block that sponsored the downward movement of price to the downside. Price return mitigated the order block, and then we see the push of price further to the downside. So we could see price get reclaimed by this order block, or price may further fall to the downside to this price level, which we can see is in confluence to this breakout block. So either we see price respect this level, or price return to the downside into this breakout block candle, and then we see price push to the upside. So this is what we are expecting to see in the EURUSD. So let's check the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, you can see that price gave us the downward movement, price return, mitigated this consolidation, and then price fell. So we could see price return into the consolidation that was broken, and then price gives us the bullish move to the upside. Because you can see in the 1-hour time frame, here we have the fair value gap. So this consolidation price level, which in the 4-hour time frame we marked out an order block zone, which we can refer to as a breaker. We can see that price may return into this level, and then we have that push of price to the upside. if price chooses to drop more further, then we should be looking at this price level here, which I marked up, which is the 1.08170 price level. This is what we're looking out for in the Euro USD pair. So guys, let's check out the GBP USD pair. So this is the GBP USD weekly time frame. But before we continue with the forecast, if you're actually new to the YouTube channel, guys, you want to be staying updated with our weekly Forex forecast, then you can do well to subscribe to the YouTube community and help us like and share our videos so that we can reach more audience with our weekly Forex forecast and other Forex educational content. So now back to the chart, back to the GBP USD weekly time frame. What we can see, last week we saw this weekly unmitigated fair value gap. So we anticipated to see either price get rejected at this level, or we see price for the push into the unmitigated weekly fair value gap. And now what we can see is that price pushed into the weekly unmitigated fair value gap. And now this is now a mitigated fair value gap. Price mitigated and close above the consequent encroachment and even above the fair value gap zone. So we're anticipating to see price push to the upside to rate this buy side liquidity. Now, but before we see the bullish move, we want to see price gives us a bearish move to the downside to this price level, which is actually the 1.27553 price level. So we want to see a bearish move on Monday through Tuesday, or possibly just on Monday, and then we begin to frame the bullish ride of price to the upside. So we are still anticipating a bullish week for the coming week in GBP USD. So let's check out the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, what we can see is the mitigation of the weekly fair value gap. And then now we can see that price gave us this up close candle on Friday, and price is reacting at this order block. So we could see price gives us that bearish move to this price level, or price might sweep Friday's low point, and then we have the bullish move of price to the upside. We're targeting to see price raid this buy side liquidity, and then we look out for the weekly buy side liquidity, which we're anticipating to see price raid in the GBP USD pair. So let's check out the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, you can see we have this fair value gap. So we could see price return to the downside because price is reacting at this order block. So we could see price return to the downside, this price level, or price may sweep Friday's low points before we see price gives us the bullish move to rate this trend line liquidity resting here. And then we target this buy side liquidity we're having here before the weekly buy side liquidity. So this is what we are looking out for in the GBP USD. I'm actually giving us a very quick one. I'm not dropping to follow a time frame. If you want to actually be staying updated with our weekly Forex forecast and possibly daily forecast, then you need to actually join the free Telegram community. So guys, this is all I have to show us about the GBP USD. So let's check out the USDJPY pair. So guys, this is our USDJPY pair. So you can see we have the buy side liquidity, we have the sell side liquidity, we have our dealing range here. Now what we can see is that price is actually bearish. We can see this massive bearish momentum movement to the downside. Price is being attracted to this weekly fair value gap. You can see we have this weekly order block here. So we're anticipating for the bearish movement of price in the USDJPY. But then before we have the continuation of the bearish movements, we want to see price get rebooked by this weekly inverse fair value gap. So we could see that reaction of price to the upside before we actually see for the push of price to the downside into this weekly fair value gap we are seeing in the weekly time frame. So we are going to see possibly by Monday that price would actually furthermore raid the sell side liquidity. Then we have a bullish move to the upside into this weekly inverse fair value gap, and then we see price falls into the weekly fair value gap. So in the USDJPY, we're anticipating to see this movement of price, and then we see price further falls to the downside. So we want to see price return to the main threshold of this weekly inverse fair value gap, or we see price may push further to the upside into this price level here, and then we see the bearish movement of price to the downside into the weekly fair value gap. So let's drop to the daily time frame so that you can actually see why also we are considering the possibility of price possibly giving us a wick to the upside, and then the down close movement that further pushes price to the downside. So let's check the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, what we're going to see is just the way we marked out. In the weekly time frame, we have the weekly inverse fair value gap. You can see we also have an inverse fair value gap in the daily time frame. So what we could anticipate is to see price push to the upside first before we see continuation of the bearish movements. So we want to see price gives us this bullish move to mitigate this fair value gaps. So we could see price take out Friday's high points, and then we see price further fall to the downside, or price may push to the upside and then give us a very sharp movement to mitigate this other fair value gap. And then we have the continuation of the bearish momentum to the downside. So let's check the 4-hour time frame. Here in the 4-hour time frame, what we're going to see is we have this order block actually resting here. That is why I'm also anticipating to see the possibility that price may push further to the upside and consider this high as a buy side liquidity region before we could see price further push to the downside. So we have this order block here. We have the fair value gap. So we could see price consider this as buy side liquidity into this price level, and then we see price falls to the downside, or price may just react at the main threshold, and then we see the bearish momentum to the downside. So guys, this is actually the weekly time frame for the gold pair. So last week we anticipated to see price actually give us the sell move, possibly to swim this candle low, mitigate this fair value gap before we see an up close candle at the end of the week. But then we can see that price return to the 50% of this weekly week, and then we can see that now price gave us the up close week to the upside. We can see that last week was bullish after we saw the bearish move on Monday, Tuesday. So we had an up close week. So we can see that price took out this buy side liquidity. So we can see that from the weekly time frame, price created an order block here because we have a down close candle and then we have an up close candle. So for the coming week, we're anticipating to see price drop to the downside to either mitigate the 50% level of this bullish candle or the 50% level of the bearish candle. Then we continue price movement to the upside. If you can remember, I've been stressing that gold is actually in a bullish market condition. So we should still expect for the bullish move of price to the upside when price return to either this price level or this price level. So let's drop to the daily time frame. So here we are in the daily time frame. So we're expecting to see price rate this buy side liquidity. So first we must understand that last week, what we can see in this Friday candle is that price gave us an indecision candlestick. So we are going to be framing the bullish bias only when we see the return of price to this price level, or we see price may sweep Friday's low points to mitigate this fair value gap we're seeing here from this candle week high to this candle week low points. And then we can also see this is actually the 50% level of the bearish candle in the weekly time frame of the order block. And then what we can see is we have a confluence of this breakout blocks zone here, because we have this up close candle that sponsored the bearish move that took out this sell side liquidity. So our anticipation for the coming week in the gold pair is to see further push of price to the downside to this price levels. Then we frame the bullish momentum to the upside, because we're looking at price raiding this buy side liquidity. So let's actually drop to the 4-hour time frame. So here we are in the 4-hour time frame. We can see that we have this order block to the downside. We have this momentum push of price to the downside. So price mitigated this order block, and then the price imbalance we have left here based on the 4-hour time frame. So we can see in the 4-hour time frame there is that return of price to this price level, and then we can see that price is pushing to the upside. So we may just see price return to this inverse fair value gap in the 4-hour time frame, and then we could see price give the bearish move to sweep Friday's low points, and then we have price push to the upside to raid the buy side liquidity. So the gold pair is actually in a bullish market condition. So price may just push further to the upside and raid the buy side liquidity, but we would want to see price actually react at the inverse fair value gap. We possibly want to see that, and then possibly frame a sell move to the downside before we have the bullish ride to the upside to raid the buy side liquidity. But you must also understand that trading against the trend is actually risky. So the market condition is bullish, but still yet we are possibly anticipating to see a bearish move of price before we get to frame the ideal bullish move of price to the upside. So let's check the 1-hour time frame. So here in the 1-hour time frame, what we can see is we have the sweep of this low points, and we have this momentum candle closing below this swing low points. So we could see that anticipation of price returning here, and then we see price possibly falls to raid Friday's low points before we frame the bullish market condition. So this is all I have to show us, guys, for the coming week in regarding the various pairs we'll actually analyze and looking out to trade for the coming week. So cheers, guys. I'll see you in the next weekly Forex Forecast.